Good morning. Bienvenue. Et merci d'être ici.
Welcome and thank you for being here with us today. I'm Tyler McCann, the director of CAPI, and like always, before starting today, I'd like to recognize that I am joining you from Western Quebec, the traditional non-ceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. No matter where we are, we must all recognize and reflect on the Indigenous people that were the first residents of our lands. When we are going towards 2023, we are pursuing the long way to reconciliation.
Seen in recent memory. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, food inflation, rising interest rates, supply chain disruptions, and the federal fertilizer emission reduction target are just a few examples of what put agriculture and food policy in the headlines. Today, we are pleased to host a webinar that will look back at the last year in agriculture and food policy and consider what lies ahead in 2023. CAPI's greatest asset is its diverse network of thought leaders from across agriculture and food and from across the country. Today, we are drawing on 4 of those leaders from our board of directors. They bring experience from across Canada and across the food system, and I look forward to a thoughtful dialogue on what changed in 2022, what may change in 2023, what should change, and what likely won't. We are also pleased to be releasing a series of short essays by CAPI directors, fellows, and staff this week and next that will be collected into a special edition of the CAPI Connection newsletter. The essay covers a wide range of topics, providing additional insight into the changing face of agriculture and food policy. I'm going to kick things off today by offering my perspective on some of the agriculture and food policy highlights from the last year, and then we will dive into the open panel discussion with our 4 panelists. During the webinar, we ask that you please submit your questions using the Q&A box on your screen, and we will do our best to answer as many questions as we can. Please feel free to share your thoughts in the Q&A throughout the dialogue. I'll now share a presentation on the highlights of the last policy year. As we look back, it's always important to keep an eye on the future, and we look forward to looking ahead with you this morning. I want to start by going back a year ago to our last year in review webinar held in January 2021. During the dialogue with our 4 panelists at that time, I asked the question, what was not getting enough attention, what didn't get enough attention in 2021, and what should get more attention in 2022? The 4 answers that we got boiled down to the risks. What are the unintended consequences of the worthy goals that we're pursuing? And are we having a good enough dialogue exploring what those consequences are? A discussion around increases in food pricing. How do we deliver affordable food to those who need it? One of the panelists remarked that it's the layering of pressures on a system that was pushed to an edge. She talked about the context in COVID and how government had taken its foot off of the regulatory gas pedal, so to speak, but would be returning to its ambitious regulatory agenda, and asked whether or not we were ready for the government policy that was to come. And finally, one of the panelists said this reality of agriculture working in silos. We don't do a good enough job connecting sectors and linking the impact of what we do in one to the other and understanding the real system that exists in agriculture. I think it's interesting to start our discussion today thinking back to those 4 areas that were not getting enough attention, because by and large, they really did drive a lot of the discussion over the last year. At the time, we may not have been able to predict that food pricing was going to be as much of an issue as it is today, but it clearly came to pass. If you think about the regulatory actions that governments undertook over the last year, it's clearly having an impact. And we really have this ongoing need to better understand what are those risks and how do they connect and impact the entire food system. Clearly, the discussion last January set up what was going to happen in 2022. And I look forward to our discussion today setting up what might happen in 2023. One thing that's really clear over the last year is that 2022 reminded us that Canadian agriculture and food is complex, global, and dynamic. This morning, we're going to provide a really high-level overview, but it can't understate how complex this system that we have. This is really a simple overview this morning of a complicated system. Also need to highlight that the system is a really global system. Often we think about it in the Canadian context, but what happens in Canada is really connected to what's happening around the world. The pressures from outside our borders can often have a huge impact on what's happening inside them. And it's a system that's dynamic. Everything seems to be changing these days. The environment, the people, our knowledge, the risks that we're facing is changing. And so trying to understand today what might impact agriculture and food over the next year is a challenge, but it's a challenge that we're up to and we look forward to getting into this morning. So over the last year, it really was a busy year for Canadian agriculture and food. I think that there are kind of four narratives that are important that I take from it. It's a system that was complex, but became more complicated. That the year drove action. There was I think an unprecedented coming together of industry through the value chain of governments in Canada and around the world. Last year really reminded us that policy matters, but ultimately I think there's a lot of pressures, there's a lot of risk, but there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of cause for optimism. So what I want to do is touch on some of these points that underscore these narratives, and then touch on a little bit of what CAPI has done about it. So the complex became more complicated. We have these collisions, these intersections that are really getting us to the point where the status quo just isn't an option anymore. Sustainability clearly is top of mind. We've just come through COP27 and COP15 that are demanding action, but the pressures on food security this year, for example, drove the EU to reconsider some of its farm to fork principles. The labor shortage is something that we talked about last year. We talked about it this year. These chronic challenges are acute and are costing Canadian agriculture and food money, but there's no simple solution. There's labor shortages across the economy that are impacting us all. The geopolitics of food is clearly changing. The Russian invasion and its impact on the critical trade of grains, oilseeds, and fertilizer got a lot of the attention. But underneath that, we have ongoing disruptions in trade. We have export controls. Countries used to have to, the global trading system was built to try and make it easier for food to get into countries. But now we have the challenge of making sure food can get out of countries and get to the places where it's needed most. And around the world, we've got this new return to an era of industrial policy and mercantilism, where countries are effectively deploying economic nationalism, and that's having an impact on a country like Canada. A year ago, we talked about food prices and affordability being an issue. I don't think at that time we understood what the impact of food inflation would really look like, and how even as inflation across the rest of the economy starts to cool down, inflation in food continues to come higher. And again, we've got not just a single factor or a small list of factors, but a long list of issues ranging from COVID to the depreciation of the dollar, those labor pressures I talked about earlier, concentration, all coming together, and much more conspiring to increase costs. And it doesn't often get a lot of attention, but really this productivity should be a big part of what helps drive the food system forward. But again, productivity is not a simple thing, and it's this complex interaction but it gives us the potential to try and address food security, sustainability goals. But unfortunately, productivity growth is going in the wrong direction. I'd like to take a minute and just talk about what CAPI did on one of those things, the geopolitics of food. Earlier in the year, when the Russian invasion of Ukraine took place and it became clear just how significant the impact would be, we held a webinar like we're holding today that looked at this, brought some perspectives. We released a report looking at what role can Canada play? How can we proactively address the crisis and the impact of the crisis? And we tried to advance new ideas and new thinking. And again, at the time when, for example, our distinguished fellow, Ted Billier, writing with a fellow from the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, they were early calling for a humanitarian food security corridor. It was really great to see that action start to take place and the benefit and the impact that was there. But we were pleased to be one of the first championing that idea in Canada. The action that was driven over the last year really, I think, showed how industry was taking leadership. That was one of the comments that our panelists talked about last year on the webinar, that industry needed to take charge, industry needed to show leadership. And I think on, you know, three important issues that really was seen front and center. So with our National Index on Agri-Food Performance, a coalition of 110 industry partners is working to really try and define and measure sustainability inside Canadian agriculture and food. Sustainability can sometimes be boiled down into simple principles, but it is a complex web, and the National Index on Agri-Food Performance has got 20 indicators, 100 metrics, more than 100 metrics that it's using to really try and present a comprehensive perspective on it. A lot of work happened over the last year, and they're looking forward to actually launching the index pilot in 2023. That labor, you know, the industry, the value chain producers, processors, farmers all came together to say, okay, you know, the time is now for us to really come up with a proactive, comprehensive plan. How do we find ways that we can close that labor and skills gap? And so, you know, the Canadian Agriculture Human Resources Council, the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, Food and Beverage Canada, and a number of other partners came together to develop the National Workforce Strategic Plan. The government is now building on it with its own consultations, and hopefully this sets up more clear action in 2023 to close that and address those acute shortages of labor and skills. And certainly something that's been front and center in the news throughout the year is the Grocery Code of Conduct. So, you know, ministers in 2021 said, you know, this is not something that we can address for a variety of different reasons. It's up to the industry to show leadership. What we know is that a lot of work is happening behind closed doors, that they've made important progress. There have been bumps along the way, but we expect to see some positive next steps in early 2023. Again, that industry leadership and action, I think, is helping to change a bit the face of agriculture policy in Canada, where government isn't always at the forefront, but it's about industry developing proactive plans and approaches. You know, a lot of this is reflected in different work that CAPI's done, but we've been happy to be part of the initiative around the National Index on Agri-Food Performance. Earlier this year, we released a research paper looking at how that index can better support, can be leveraged for policy making in Canada. One of the things that we said at the time was that it has a real potential to help make sure everybody's on the same starting point. It's not necessarily going to make it easy. It's not necessarily going to mean that we all agree on what the right policy solutions are for sustainability, but getting everybody to agree on how we define it, how we measure it, really will make the rest of the process easier than it could be if it was just a matter of everybody coming to the table with their own definitions and ways of approaching and considering sustainability. We're pleased to continue to work with David McInnes and all of the partners now to really try to get to the point of how do we then build the narratives that really bring that consensus around defining sustainability to life. You know, I could have come up with a long list here, but this reminder, we were reminded throughout the year about how important policy is. And I think also reminded that outcomes from policy development are better when we do that policy development together. Ministers from across the country, officials inside government, really took the lead on developing a new agriculture policy framework. It was nice to see in July an announcement that not only had they reached an agreement, that they reached an agreement on their desired timelines, but they agreed to increase investments. You know, the agriculture policy framework had largely been a status quo program framework for some time, but we now see we've got an ambitious framework that aims to reduce emissions, increase revenue and exports, increase diversity in agriculture and food, but also increase spending in it. And we look forward to seeing how that plays out. The federal emission reduction target and policies being put in place by the federal government to improve sustainability, to reduce emissions, was certainly front and center over the year. You know, it really was this great example of the collision that exists between productivity, food security, farm incomes, and sustainability. And it also highlighted that policy really is better when done together. And, you know, the federal government launched a consultation process, but clearly there was a desire and appetite and need for more reasoned dialogue and more meaningful engagement on behalf of government and industry. And the geopolitics of food, this international policy action was really quite at an unprecedented level. The G7, G20, APEC, the United Nations were all making food security a priority. They were all talking about how do we meet this challenge of addressing food security concerns, of producing food sustainably, of addressing trade and productivity. And how do we adjust to this new reality of disrupted trade? How do we recognize that looking increasingly unlikely that we're going to go back to the old way of doing business, but we need to find new solutions at the end of the day. You know, we at CAPI are really interested in that FPT policy framework. It really should underpin, it has the potential to underpin a lot of action and a lot of positive outcomes for the sector. This year, we released a report on the future of the environmental farm plan, which forms one of those direct links between the ag policy framework and producers across the country. We looked at some of the challenges in cross-compliance and business risk management program that got a lot of attention from governments and producers. And again, we had commentaries and thought leadership written around how can we really do a better job of making policy together? How can we make sure that we're driving that the FPT agreement, that ag policy framework, is a positive vision for the future? And we were pleased to announce a distinguished fellow, Dr. Grace Skogstad, who's going to look at this issue and look at the FPT dynamic. It's something that just doesn't get enough attention, but is of critical importance to the sector in Canada. But ultimately, there really is this cause for optimism. And there's a lot of storm clouds on the horizon, a lot of challenges that do exist, but the fundamentals are in place for the agriculture sector in Canada, for agriculture and food, to really step up and be a driver and be a leader. Budget 22 included another round of significant investments in agriculture and food. Budget 2021 announced new sustainability initiatives. The federal government came to the table with more money in 2022. We're seeing investments and production come online in plant proteins and canola crush capacity. There's this extra value that's going to come online, or an extra added value that's going to come online for Canadian agriculture in 2023 and into the future. We see this interesting dynamic around the financial viability, particularly of producers. A lot of focus is on the impact of input costs and inflation in those input costs driving the costs, the risks that farmers face higher. But at the same time, we know that our revenues and net worth are increasing too. And as long as we've got the right risk management tools in place, the financial viability of most farms in this country should be a strong one. And we have this interesting potential to build on that financial viability by adding value, driving outcomes and boosting productivity in a way that really builds the sustainability advantage that improves the financial viability in Canadian farms. And I think the greatest cause for optimism is just this increased awareness of agriculture and food. Again, we've been in the headlines. The sector's been in the headlines all summer long. I think the question gets to be, all year long. The question gets to be, can the sector leverage that awareness to get action and results? And so, I think a lot of the work that we've done really talks about the opportunities that exist. We've talked about the potential for agriculture and food coming out of the food security crisis. We've talked about the way that agriculture and food can lead in this friendshoring doctrine that's being advanced by Deputy Prime Minister Freeland. We've talked about investments. We had a great session with small-scale food processors earlier this year, looking at how investment can help grow that sector that can have a positive impact from coast to coast to coast. And clearly, we looked at the potential of sustainability and the role that agriculture can play as part of a solutions provider. And over the summer and into the fall, we've had an interesting series of webinars building on research done by Statistics Canada that addresses, again, what are the fundamentals? What's actually happening out across the countryside? What do the data tells us? And there's a lot of really good news there. We see farmers are adopting more sustainable practices. We see, for the first time in a long time, more women actually engaged in agriculture, that we're delivering on that diversity at the end of the day. I think you look across the work that we've done, what we see happening across the sector, we see a lot of cause for optimism. But three things are still going to be true. We still have a complex, global, and dynamic system, and that's been a struggle over the last year. It's going to continue to be a struggle over the next year. But looking ahead, I think we see the opportunity to seize that optimism, but it's going to require hard work and new solutions. So some specific things that we're looking to at CAPI are, how do we turn these risks into opportunities? And we'll get into that in our panel discussion after, but what role does policy play turning risks from climate geopolitics, finance, into opportunities for the sector? Yesterday, the federal government announced its sustainable agriculture strategy. I think they've got a consultation document. They have an advisory committee that CAPI is pleased to be able to participate on. But there's this real question around, at the end of the day, is a sustainable agriculture strategy going to be evolutionary, revolutionary, or is it just going to maintain the status quo? I'm not sure that there's whether evolutionary or revolutionary is right, but the status quo clearly isn't an option anymore for Canadian agriculture and food. As we look to governments to start to implement the next policy framework, we'll see that those details matter. We've got a significant new investment in a resilient lands program. It's going to be interesting to see what opportunities does that present to producers. How can we actually turn that into an economic advantage? And ultimately, is the tone of FPT relations going to continue to improve? Can we see governments work together better? Around the world, we've got a new geopolitical order that seems to be taking shape. We talked about Deputy Minister Freeland's friendshoring initiative. We've got governments trying to find ways to implement a more sustainable trade agenda. We've got countries around the world looking at a new way of dealing with China. We've seen that in Canada with our new Indo-Pacific strategy. What does that mean? How does agriculture in Canada play a role in this? And ultimately, we have this much broader challenge. For many years, the struggle in agriculture and food was, what do we do with all of the excess food that we're producing? We have this problem of abundance, but many of the challenges on the horizon seem to be pointing towards a future challenge of scarcity. We've got new sources of demand coming up. We've got pressures on production, and we've got this challenge of boosting productivity. So what can we do in 2023 to make sure we're positioning agriculture and food in Canada really to take advantage of these, to really seize the optimism that exists, but to manage all of the challenges that are inherently in here? I'd like to share 3 things that we're looking to do early in the new year at CAPI that I think are going to, we looked at engage you all with. At the end of January, CAPI, alongside the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and the Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance, is going to be hosting a day-long conference in Ottawa around how Canada's role in a hungry world. How do we improve our position in this shifting geopolitical landscape? We're really looking forward to a day filled with speakers from across Canada or around the world, shining a light on the challenges and the opportunities that are there. We are about to announce 4 new doctoral fellows that are going to look at this collision of trade, food security, sustainability. They've got 4 really interesting projects. We look forward to sharing more details with you on that in the days ahead. And CAPI has a pretty ambitious research agenda. We now share a quarterly research update with our partners, and would look forward to sharing that update with you so you can see the wide variety of topics that we're covering and the ways that we're covering them in 2023. But we can only do this with your support. We appreciate the ongoing support that we've got. There really are 3 ways that you can support CAPI's ongoing work in 2023. Become a partner. That we've got 2 partnership levels. I spoke a minute ago about the quarterly research update. That's one of the benefits that you get when you start to work with CAPI, but there's more. If you'd like to find out more, please reach out to myself or Bree Jones, our Director of Partnerships and Business Development. We've got a variety of projects that are underway, including one that's funded by the RBC Tech for Nature Foundation. There are other projects that we are developing that we're looking for support for, but we're also interested in hearing from you. What projects would you like to see CAPI undertake? You could also support one of the events that we're hosting, like our conference at the end of Ottawa with our partners. And finally, you can become a donor. CAPI is pleased to be able to work with the Canadian Agriculture and Food Foundation, CAF, so that really enables philanthropic donors, the organizations, to support the work that we do every day. There's an opportunity for you to receive a tax receipt for the donation that you make. Please consider donating to CAF in 2023. And with that, I'd like to start to bring in the rest of our panel and bring more people into the discussion. Ce matin, je vais commencer avec
This morning, I'm going to start with one of our board members, Stephanie Hamlin. She's an agronomist and she holds the position of a senior credit risk manager at the National Bank of Canada. She's one of the founding members of the Plateforme de Formation en Entrepreneuriat Agricole de l'Université Laval, an initiative that equips entrepreneurs for leadership and success in business. She sits and has sat on several boards of directors, committees of associations, and quality organizations, including the Fonds Coopératif d'Aide à la Relève Agricole. Mrs. Hamlin has more than 20 years of experience in management, marketing, and financing, and has held various key positions in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Quebec with financial institutions. She holds a degree in agroeconomics from Laval University and an executive MBA, including a training period at Babson College in Boston. Stephanie, I mentioned several times risks in the matter, and you work with risks on a daily basis. So I'd like to start with simple questions, but the answers are complex. How has risk evolved in 2022 with the farmers and entrepreneurs? How did they adapt, and how does the agri-food sector in Canada can transform risks into opportunities? Well, thank you very much. Hello, everybody. What a privilege, really, to be here with you today. According to me, several risks that we're seeing since the start of the pandemic have only been exacerbated in 2022. I would like to continue by telling you that to know what the risks are enables us to better manage things and also to better take decisions. Now, we're not going to talk here about all the risks that we are facing in our agri-food companies, because it's something very complex and ample. And believe me, we don't have enough time for all of that. But what I'd rather want to do is to make a synthesis of the risks that touch or have touched our agri-food enterprises. What happened this last year, we could say it simply, all the parameters, the macro and microeconomic parameters that are what we measure our companies and our enterprises with, got derailed. And this happened to a degree that was never seen before. Tyler spoke of different risks: geopolitical, environmental, economical, financial, but I am going to focus on 5 main ones this morning. First of all, I'd like to tell you that in my expertise or in my practice, and of course, this doesn't mean my employer, I see that agri-food companies proved an amazing resiliency. And that makes me think of a mathematical formula that is very simple. Since 2020, CPA spoke about it with us. Now, visualize the following. You have resiliency plus adaptability plus innovation, and all of this equals sustainability. And I would like to push things further, and I would like to see that that means that our business can continue further and further. Now, if we talk economics and finances, we saw a successive increase in interest rates and inflation that pushed to the top prices, and people had to master their numbers and to work in collaboration with their accountants, their management counselors, to better understand the advantages of using sensitivity tests to understand how my company will react to the economic stresses, and how will I be able as an entrepreneur to take profits that will be good for me. Now, certain companies went to solutions to better manage their cash flow, and they used accountants to reevaluate the structure of their companies and to arrive to an agreement that will be profitable short, mid, and long term for their companies. Now, I will go to the second risk. According to me, it's something general. It's about uh, rules, about governance. And I'd say about governance that one can see very clearly that there's a diversification of businesses in our companies, and CEOs are less vulnerable as to income from one sector and another. And different agricultural producers invest in trade, in real estate. We're talking also about being close to the farms, and other companies, even other agricultural companies, even rent their sites, and we recognize, in fact, that the film is doing things in different regions of Canada. We also can see an emergence of business models that are a bit more limited, smaller companies that have a very important effect in the economic development of companies that are farther away. And this can be seen very clearly out east in our country. Now, another point that I'd like to mention is that although we are at the beginning for small and mid-sized companies, we are very concentrated on ESG. We'll talk about it later. This is really coming up, and big companies are already acting on that. You see the pressure, but on the other hand, there is still a challenge as to the robustness and the degree to which we can use performance indicators in ESG. I will go now to the third risk that I'd like to identify with you. At the global level, I talk operations, supply, workforce, etc. And I'd say that what is very clear is that our companies use technology, modeling, and AI to be able to work on management efficiency in the farm to the industry going through the consumer. And of course, robotization can help to a certain degree to reduce the problems with the workforce and also to plan investments for our entrepreneurs. Now, fourth risk, here I would say, if we talk about technology, security, protection of information, you know, and you agree with me, that protecting and securing all our advantages means that we have to have a very advanced infrastructure. We have to have rules. We have to deal with intellectual property. And recently we saw certain unfortunate cases where criminals went to the IT in Agri-Food. And we shouldn't minimize this aspect for our agricultural producers, because all their data could be very interesting for certain criminal networks. Some professionals, including financial entities, already use best-in-class things that are very interesting in cybersecurity and information protection. And that's an advantage that is not negligible for our agricultural entrepreneurs. And I will finish with a fifth environmental risk. The environmental risk. And I'd like to say that here we have to become aware in the sense that the agricultural agent is essential to preserve our ecosystems. And as far as ESG standards, of course, there's still work to do, but several farmers, I would say for a long time, have had good ESG practices on a daily basis. Solar panels, applications to causes that are very dear to them, and even ecological and scientific matters as far as soil health is concerned. There's been a lot of progress made by our farmers. They're really leaders that have to be considered, and I sincerely believe that their leadership has to be valued and has to be put front and center. Why? Because certain producers are already present on the public front, and I believe that this is a wealth of knowledge that is practical and essential. So, Tyler, those are my comments concerning the risk. I really wanted to underline things in a very summarized way. Thank you, Stephanie. I'd like a follow-up on the role of government. It is clear that the risks that you mentioned are really a responsibility of the producers, the entrepreneurs, the people that work in the value chain, but the government should have a role. So what is the role of government? How can agricultural policies support producers and entrepreneurs in risk management? Excellent question, Tyler. And I could say that indeed, I spoke about it briefly. Looking for solutions is something that is done at the beginning on the field. Our farmers, our consumers as well. But these solutions are there, but the leadership of government, that is not new. That leadership has to consolidate our alignments as an industry, and it has to remain essential, that contribution. And I would even say that this leadership has to enable us as an industry, as actors, to have a general, larger perspective and see the effect that this will have on health and on the economy as well. So it is important to share our challenges, to find solutions together. And the best way to get to it, according to me, is to work in synergy together without necessarily minimizing our individual interests. But we have to, first of all, think in a global way as to our interests and our collective needs. And according to me, there are certain ideas that were already brought, and we've worked together as to competitivity in agri-food, and there are three pillars that have to be taken into account. I'll mention them very fast. First pillar would be, according to me, protecting our agricultural patrimony. I'm talking about living ecosystem, for example. Second, to have access to education, to be together in our scientific pathways. There are things that are done, but we should push this aspect even further, because we have to think about the succession in entrepreneurship. And thirdly, the third point is that we should also promote an ease of access and admissibility to our capital. There are many government programs, many subsidies, and there are revenue protection programs, but we have to make them more available for the professionals in agri-food, and that's a challenge, but it is essential for, how should I put it, this accessibility would be very, very positive for our enterprises to grow. Thank you very much, Stephanie. Now, the next question.
Andrea Barnett. And Andrea is, again, a CAPI director, but spends her days as a rancher on a 1,200 head, 5th generation cow-calf operation in rural British Columbia. She has 15 years of experience working in conservation and natural resources, and brings an understanding of this higher level context and the need for conservation, specific knowledge of existing strategies, relationships with partners, and appreciation of that big picture that Stephanie talked about a minute ago, as well as, you know, a skilled and muscular attitude towards identifying and tackling the details. Andrea is currently the coordinator of the Target 1 Funders Collaborative, where she acts as a central coordinating body for 30 foundations involved in assisting Canada reach its convention on biological diversity targets. Andrea has experience working with First Nations on land use issues through her work as industry analyst and communications coordinator with the BC Cattlemen's Association. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and Philosophy from the University of Victoria, a Master of Public Policy from Simon Fraser University, and a Results-Centered Leadership Certificate from the Delphi Group. You know, Andrea, we talked with Stephanie about risks and opportunities, and sometimes these are in the eye of the beholder. You know, certainly this focus on environmental, social, and governance issues is a tremendous opportunity for the sector, but a lot of people see it as a risk too. You know, ESG is an issue for investors, but it's also a priority for consumers and governments. And so what I wanted to start with you on is how do you see this playing out on farms? How do you see this playing out at a higher level across the country? I would note maybe that, you know, COP15 is underway in Montreal right now. There's a focus on, again, the role that land use plays and the potential that's there. And so, you know, is this a sign that we'll see more of that opportunity and more of an understanding of what this really means for producers across the country in 2023?
Great. Thank you so much, Tyler. I'm joining you today from Secwepemc territory, and I'm really just so pleased to be here with my esteemed colleagues. It's such a privilege. And as Tyler indicates, I wear a lot of hats. I'm a rancher, I'm a primary producer, and I'm a policy analyst. And one of the sort of main spaces in which I've worked is conservation and the environment. So I would really ground a lot of what I'm saying in that perspective. But I also, as a primary producer, bring sort of the agriculture bent and flavor into what I'm saying. And so, I mean, I guess I would just, you know, echoing a lot of what Stephanie has said, I would just sort of want to anchor our discussion a little bit in just the high level point that we live in, and as Tyler points out, a complex society where we see increasingly these cross-cutting issues and values, and we see individual sectors, in our case today, agriculture, being asked to really consider these broader issues in both policy and practice. And I'm here to say that I think it's great, and it certainly brings with it a bunch of challenges. But I think it is really a wonderful evolution we're seeing in policy. And I guess, you know, primarily when I'm looking at the ag sector and what we're increasingly being asked to consider, and again, this is repeating a little bit of what Tyler said and also Stephanie, but I think it, you know, just to put a really clear point on some of these issues, certainly the environment, both from a climate change perspective and also from a biodiversity, conservation and species at risk perspective. I would also really like to highlight an increased focus, thank goodness, on diversity and inclusion. Additionally, one of the things that I would really highlight is a focus on reconciliation as a cross-cutting issue throughout society. And you see this in the food system, both in terms of creating new opportunities for Indigenous participation and the inclusion of traditional foodways and systems in our food system, as well as correcting inequalities and disproportionate food insecurity in Indigenous and Northern communities, and also issues of moving forward and advancing issues towards reconciliation around rights and title, and a movement in many jurisdictions toward shared decision-making. And we see evidence of this in all ag policy documents. In preparation for this panel, I sort of treated myself to the survey of all the recent documents. And, you know, whether we're talking about budgets or mandate letters, even most recently in British Columbia, or had new mandate letters issued last week, you know, the Guelph statement, the new FedProv partnership, and recently yesterday, the new Sustainable Ag Plan. We see all of these cross-cutting things baked in. And it's not just government documents. We see non-government also wanting the same thing, whether it's the consumer, whether it's the financial sector, whether it's philanthropy influencing the way they grant, whether it's NGOs influencing the way they target programs, as well as the priorities of many industry associations. And I think fundamentally, this is a really great thing. And increasingly, what I would observe over the last year, really intensifying in the last couple of years, is that groups and individuals who are willing to work at these intersection points are increasingly in a position to wield influence, and oftentimes to sort of receive whether it's funding or grants. And I think that this is a really great thing. You know, I look to the leadership and our friends at groups like Farmers for Climate Solutions as a really great example. And there are others, but of groups that are really willing to work at these intersection points. Now, this being said, and I don't know, Tyler, whether you want me to go into specific details of what this looks like on the farm for farmers, for producers. I have a couple of examples I can share. Did you want me to go into that now, Tyler?
Yeah. So I've got two. I mean, if you could share an example on, I'm curious again on the biodiversity, just because it's in the news with COP15, but really also interested on that Indigenous relationship. If you would, again, I think farming in BC, the context of the relationship with Indigenous communities is different, but what does that actually mean? And what does that look like in action? You know, we often think about these things at a high level, but it's clear as time goes on, this is becoming a real practical issue. So how do you see that playing out?
Okay, I'm going to do reconciliation first, and then I'm going to talk a bit about biodiversity. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak about reconciliation, because I mean it's certainly a huge passion of mine, and I think it's really central to the work of all Canadians. And I really think we are being invited at this stage to really consider across all of agriculture how this works. And I would preface this by saying, you know, being a rancher in British Columbia, I think provides me with a bit of a different perspective, maybe slightly more acute in terms of reconciliation being an issue that individual producers are dealing with. As a rancher, we deal a lot with public land. And as we know, British Columbia is largely unceded territory, which means that there's actually legal questions around who owns the land. We've also, we are a province that ratified the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People through the DRIPA legislation that was passed. So, you know, while some of the things that I'm going to share in a moment here might not be entirely relatable across Canada, I think much of it is, and I would argue that increasingly we are going to see reconciliation as being sort of a major opportunity and also challenge. So, you know, for us as ranchers, again, really grounded in my personal perspective, a move towards reconciliation is really accepting that there is uncertainty around tenure and resources for us as rights and title negotiations between Indigenous governments and Crown governments progress. Things like, access to leased land and licensed land. That's really up for it's really up for debate, and it's challenging and it's scary for individual producers. Additionally, things like permitting can become more complex with increased requirement. Which is a great thing for consultation with Indigenous people. This can really protract processes for things like, getting fences built and referrals around other infrastructure. And as we move towards shared decision making, which in British Columbia there's a strong commitment, we see that Indigenous groups are going to have a really large deciding role on a lot of our legislation, a lot of our policy, a lot of our planning. So, whether we're talking about wildlife or whether we're talking about soil, whether we're talking about water, increasingly there's going to be another landlord, there's going to be another decision maker. And so again, that can make ranchers feel pretty vulnerable. And it's also an opportunity. And I guess what I would sort of say, for me, as I see this play out for us on our ranch, I really try to ground myself in this this idea that a lot of reconciliation is about rebuilding community among individual groups and particularly users of the land. And so for us on our ranch, we really try to focus on, what are the shared interests, and there are many. Whether it's, reaching out for community meetings, working together on issues of policy, there's a ton of opportunity. And one of the things that I think is a policy gap that needs to continue to be sort of fleshed out, because a lot of reconciliation is a government to government relationship. Sometimes stakeholder groups are absent from a lot of those discussions. And I'm not suggesting G to G needs to be G to G, but there is a space around and a question around how do we support agriculture in the context of government to government negotiations. Tyler, I don't know, how is our time? Should I talk a little bit about
if you can touch on biodiversity really quickly, that'd be great.
For sure. Well, I mean, and I would just say, we see the COP right now and a commitment to conserving 30% of Canada's biodiversity by 2030. And increasingly, we see a lot of tremendous efforts, both from governments as well as from the private sector and philanthropy. There's a lot of really interesting opportunities to help, up the ante on conservation. And I think I would say on this, in terms of helping individual producers, I think that while there's a ton of great work and excellent examples, either industry-led or NGO-led, I do think that there's a lot of confusion. And as we move forward, I think it's really, really important to support and provide community to individual producers who want to pursue, whether it's BMPs or whether it's, designations that, contribute towards our biodiversity targets. I think government or industry or NGOs helping to provide a service that helps to kind of pre-digest and make different options sort of more available to producers to understand at a farm level. We see groups doing things like mentorship programs. I think that's fabulous. We see producers really reaching for communities, for example, the regenerative agriculture community, where there's a lot of information and fellowship around some of this stuff. So I think particularly for small farms and individual farm families, I think moving forward as we look at the implementation of the next FedProv agreement and some of the exciting opportunities there, it's really about how do we attach all of this opportunity and potential to the individual farm and help work these really capacity strapped, in many cases, farmers through what the next right thing is. I hope I didn't take too much time, Tyler.
That's good, Andrea. I'm going to want to pick up that theme about confusion, but on the government side with Rory in a minute. So Rory McAlpine is up next. He recently retired as the Senior Vice President of Government and Industry Relations with Maple Leaf Foods. Prior to his 15 years at Maple Leaf, Rory served as the Deputy Minister of the BC Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Fisheries. He held previous roles in Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada as the Director General of the International Trade Policy Directorate, as Executive Director of the National Farm Products Council, Director of the Grains and Oilseeds Division, and Deputy Director of Multilateral Trade. Rory is currently a board member of agri-food sector organizations, including CAPI, VITO at the University of Saskatchewan, a member of the Food from Thought Advisory Committee, the University of Guelph, and a director of the James Bay Community Project. Rory received an MA degree in economics from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland and has also studied at the University of Geneva in Switzerland. You know, Rory, Andrea talked about, you know, the confusion of how do you make sense of this? And she also touched on, you know, these increasing interests and pressures from a growing diverse group of stakeholders who really are expecting agriculture and food to do more. You know, I think sometimes that's clearly a challenge for producers and processors, but it's also a challenge for policymakers across the country as they try and manage what are often competing interests. You know, we've got these calls for more productivity, more profitability, more sustainability, more equity, and the list goes on. You know, I touched on FPT relations as something that CAPI works on, but, you know, I'm wondering, do you think that policymakers, this complex governance system that they operate in, is able to manage all of these pressures? Do we have the right systems in place to get good agriculture and food policy in Canada that enables us to seize the opportunities that exist?
Well, thank you, Tyler, for the questions, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you. I'm also joining you from British Columbia, a little further west than Andrea on the West Coast in Victoria. So look, let me touch on three buckets of kind of issues in responding to that question of how to best manage the pressures and the trade-offs that have to inherently be addressed to arrive at better agri-food policy. I'll say a few things about the very foundations of policy and programs. How do we strengthen them? Secondly, that bugaboo of whole of government thinking and action. How can we do better there? And then finally, I want to say a few things about how to dial up that policy focus and try to dial down the partisanship that sometimes slows progress and creates acrimony. In terms of the foundations, and you know, Stephanie touched on this, you know, what is the role of government? And here's what an interesting fact: the OECD has found that the general services delivered to agriculture in Canada have declined from 6% of the sector's value in 2000 to 3% of the sector's size in 2019-21. By that, I mean general services defined by the OECD are the core functions of, you know, food inspection, animal health protection, the extension services, environmental programs, the things that aren't tied to production or farm incomes, but which are just core services of government. And so think about that. We've basically cut in half relative to the sector size, the delivery of those foundational pieces to support the sector. So, you know, I just feel we cannot afford to further erode investments in food safety, animal health, plant health. Interesting, CFIA has been flat. I thought they'd increased their funding over the last 5 years. When you look at the data, it's actually been flat at about $800 million a year. Scientific research, statistics, gathering and collecting, analyzing statistics, policy analysis capability, particularly beyond economics, environment, social, all that integration of that policy expertise. Innovation, export market development, and very fundamentally trade policy and trade management. Those are the core things that have to be sustained for our sector to thrive. And of course, most of all, for me and my experience, there's so much needs to be addressed in the space of regulatory efficiency, effectiveness, and timeliness. I've noticed CFIA has identified their plans for what they call CFIA 2025, Building for the Future. So they've identified a commitment to be more effective and, I guess, more supportive of industry innovation and timeliness of action, But interestingly, their current planning does not identify their commitments under the Agri-Food and Aquaculture Regulatory Roadmap, which in 2019, we all thought was going to be the kind of the unifying cross-government agenda of regulatory action across the mandates of CFIA, Health Canada, Agriculture Canada, and so on. And again, COVID interfered, but it seems to have slipped away, and that to me is unfortunate. And we need, I do think as a foundational element, we need a strong commitment to industry-government partnership based on a real foundation of transparency and inclusivity, evidence-based consultation, not just putting out a document and then waiting for written questionnaires. Like, there's got to be much more meaningful engagement. And I know the sector roundtables have been reconstituted. I'm disappointed, though, for example, the economic strategy table for agri-food, again, it's gone. It was created again. I know COVID had a big impact on some of these processes, but I really feel we need a permanent advisory body, top-level senior officials, not sectoral roundtables or thematic roundtables, but at the highest level, some kind of a more permanent institutionalized way of dialoguing on these bigger themes and longer-term priorities. So second bucket, whole of government thinking. How do we move from rhetoric to action? Whole of government is, of course, a buzzword for a long time. And, really we have to accept that agri-food policy is very much, or success for the agri-food sector, it's about aligning basically four things in my view: technology, people, policy, and economics. And those issues then reach out into all sorts of areas, but they touch on so many mandates just within the federal government family, let alone on a federal provincial basis. And I'll come back to that. And now more than ever, the climate crisis absolutely demands an integrated whole of government approach. We have to act differently like never before. And I think it's important to note how we have acted differently in the case of COVID. We shifted from a business as usual approach in government, in industry, and the way industry and government work together on some very urgent and serious threats to our health and safety of employees, to inspection services, to plant operations. And there was a real spirit of kind of a Team Canada can do, let's get it done. And we have to my view, replicate that in confronting the climate crisis in the way everyone comes together. I am encouraged, for example, to see now labor. It's taken 10 years, but labor is in the center of the conversation about ag policy. It's still a long way to go, but the fact that there's going to be consultations now on a national agri-food labor strategy is very encouraging. We can do it, but why should it take 10 years? I am disappointed in the food policy for Canada. Again, I know COVID has been an interruption, but the hope that would truly be a center of government, whole of government driver of integrated thinking and action, it still feels like it's very much driven from Agriculture Canada and the Minister of Agriculture. I would love to see it supported from the center and really being supported with an independent secretariat with a budget and so on. And there are clearly still some machinery of government issues around that integration. For example, the food and beverage manufacturing industry. It's great to see that ISED has become much more engaged on the issues facing food manufacturing. And through they're the leaders really of the strategy tables on this. But I guess there's still a bit of confusion, like who's really driving the bus on the food and beverage industry? Is it Ag Canada? Is it ISED? It just feels like we could be clearer about where to host that critical piece of the puzzle in ag policy. And then finally, the point about how to dial up the focus, the policy focus, and dial down some of the partisanship. This is back to, really how to strengthen the foundations. I really feel that, governments have to do well what only governments can do. Only government can deliver a food safety system for the country that's internationally recognizes and ensures CFIA can sign export certificates to gain market access. Only government can do that. Only government can negotiate trade agreements. Only government can set the standards for protecting labor and the environment. Emergency preparedness, we can only have a system that'll work if government owns the responsibility and invests and deals with it. And these and then as COVID and climate change demonstrate, the fundamentals of public health protection, environmental protection, these are core to government. And so we just can't take any of that for granted. And I feel there's a real opportunity here to be more focused and frankly, a little more bureaucratic courage. Maybe that's it, to try to separate out the partisanship and just get the job done more efficiently and collaboratively in those areas that, generally speaking, are not as controversial or fraught politically as some of the other issues. For example, we all know Agri-Food, agri-stability, for example, business risk management, the agri-stability reference margin limits, that's very political, and really only governments and politicians can negotiate solutions to that. But reducing nitrous oxide emissions from fertilizers should not be political, right? It shouldn't. Protecting Ontario's green belt. What is the right balance of protecting that for urban development versus farm and natural, capital? That's political. There's trade-offs there. But protecting hog farmers from African swine fever, it should not be political. It should be not partisan. There's clearly issues that require consideration of economic equity, intergenerational trade-offs. Those have to be negotiated. Supply management, right? Interprovincial cost sharing, food security, these are political, and we obviously depend on a democratic, inclusive process of our representatives coming to solutions on those things. We're too quick, in my view, often to put a partisan lens on everything, and that does get magnified in our system where provincial leaders are, picking arguments with Ottawa. There's, tension in the system, and it can get cast on to all kinds of issues that really shouldn't be. But we just have to be, I think, a little better at deciding what is worth a fight with Ottawa and what isn't. So on Fed-Prov cooperation, again, let's focus. Agri-food policy is not healthcare policy. Like, healthcare policy is very challenging in this country. But the climate crisis, again, just demands a whole of government, a whole of Canada solution. Between 1990 and 2020, GHG emissions from agriculture in Canada grew 33%. If that's not a crisis in this current global environment, I don't know what is. We've got to step forward with the Sustainable Canadian Agriculture Policy Framework that's been agreed. Great, a whole kind of united view of the critical importance of investing in sustainability. But we got to move that beyond just a policy framework or just beyond a program framework, honestly, into a policy framework. To me, it's more of a program framework than a policy framework. Even, for example, what about putting some emission reduction targets right into that agreement? Where, right now, as we know, apart from the nitrous oxide emission target for fertilizer, the ag and food sector in Canada does not have a target. We're part of the global national targets to get to net zero by 2050. But what are the targets specific to agriculture? Without that, let's bake it into the agreement. And we saw yesterday the Sustainable Ag Strategy, great to see, but it's a federal-only document. And certainly, I've read through it. It makes acknowledgement of the critical need to connect to the provinces and all the stakeholders. But, really, how can in 2022 can you deliver a national agri-food sustainability strategy without a real partnership with the jurisdictions that actually regulate land use for the most part and deliver, all kinds of direct impacts on how farming occurs and how farms manage for sustainability. And finally, I guess I would just say that in the past, Canada has marshaled a whole of government, a whole of Canada approach to big issues. I mean, you think about how the country settled the West, and under the Dominion Land Act, actually, parceled out farmland, improvement obligations to farmers. Like, that was a whole national effort to build a farm and agriculture and settle the West of Canada. It was done on a whole of Canada basis. The infrastructure investments we've made. We built a railroad, to move grain. It was a national project, a huge thing. We fed Europe during World War II as a national commitment, right? We did some big things. And we've been very good at a Team Canada approach to trade negotiations and trade policy, right? We get our act together and we deliver for Canada. Well, now it's time, in my view, to do exactly the same thing when it comes to the climate crisis in agriculture. I'll just finish with the quote that actually comes from the RBC report on sustainability that just came out a couple of weeks ago. They said, by seizing the same spirit of collaboration now, Canadian agriculture can lead the world in the fight against climate change. And I couldn't agree more. So thanks for that, Tyler.
Thank you, Rory. And so going to go to Chantal now and pick up on two of the things that you mentioned with my question to her. But so Chantal O'Donoghue, we're quite pleased to have her as our board chair here at CAPI. She brings over 20 years of experience to her current role as the Vice President and Sustainability Director for Cargill Agriculture Supply Chain North America for Cargill. Chantal is a strong leader and a collaborator within the industry, as evidenced by her previous and current roles in numerous agri-food related boards and initiatives with sustainability and public trust, and is committed to ensuring Canada is at the forefront of a thriving agri-food sector. In 2019, she was inducted into the Saskatchewan Agriculture Hall of Fame and is currently chair here at CAPI. She has a Bachelor of Commerce degree from the University of Alberta, where she obtained a double major in marketing and ag economics. She and her husband, Greg, operate a grain farm in Biggar, Saskatchewan. You know, Chantal, Rory talked about a need for a whole of government approach. And we're going to start with kind of a broader question to you and then bring the others in on it after. You know, I think if you look around the world, there's this opportunity that has come up time and time again, this demand for more food, more sustainable food, more resilient, more reliable food. These are all creating opportunities for Canadian agriculture. But what do we need to do to really take advantage of that in 2023? And I'm going to build on Rory's comment about a whole of government approach. If you were the agriculture minister today, Chantal, and you were going to see the prime minister and tell him what the entire government needed to do to really take advantage of those opportunities, what would you be telling the prime minister should be that whole of government approach for agriculture and food?
Yeah, and I think you've heard this theme through the previous speakers, and thanks again for having me here today. The opportunity that we have, I'm not going to say it's a challenge by any means. It's a challenge and it's complex, but as Canadians, we've time over time again come together and come forward with solutions. What we need to do now to seize the opportunity that is in front of us is agriculture and agricultural production as it relates to climate and feeding a growing population is at the forefront of everything. There are more eyes on what we do every day, and we are part of the solution. But the reality is, and Tyler, you look to your slide, one of your first slides from a sustainability and environment perspective, we need to educate. We need to come together holistically. We cannot operate in silos. Government cannot operate in silos. Industry cannot operate in silos. Front end and back end of the supply chain, environmental groups cannot operate in silos. We need to figure out how to come together. We have targets that are out far in the future. We need to be declarative as a country on what they are. We need to recognize that the tools that allow us to meet those targets look different. They look different within a province. They look different from farm to farm. So we need to focus on the outcomes. We need to recognize that prescription isn't necessarily always the best thing because the prescription is different in this vast country that we have. But what is absolutely most important, and we have an opportunity, I would say we're not doing the greatest job right now, but there is a passion and a desire to break everything down. And we need to figure out, Rory alluded to it, right? So we have ISA taking great interest in agriculture and food. We have our traditional agriculture bureaucratic components, nationally and federally. That all has to come together. And we have to come together with a solution hat, right? We don't want to, of course, we need to challenge. Of course, we need to make sure that fit is right. But we need to do what Canada can do and has done so well in the past. Come together, break those barriers down, take time to evolve, to build culture, to educate across, and we will get to where we need to go in a manner that allows us to continue to provide the reliable, predictable food to Canadians, to the world, and keep economic viability and keep that food affordable and keep economic viability and environmental viability and resiliency in a way that can sustain. We don't have to solve it all today, but we do need to break everything down and come together with these solutions in mind.
So Chantal, one of the things that you talked about again was setting targets, then coming together with a plan to figure out how to achieve them. arguably one of the biggest news is stories in agriculture policy last year in 2022 was around the fertilizer target, where the federal government did just that. It set a very ambitious target and said, we're going to work together to figure out how to achieve it, and effectively saw kind of that issue blow up and kind of spiral out of control on them. Without maybe looking at that specific issue, but how do we do that? How if again we're talking about how, you know, a whole of government approach, how does do we have the right systems? Can we get to a point where we're actually doing coming up with these solutions together, and what are the things that you would look for concretely as signs that that is a true meaningful partnership that is coming up with solutions?
Yeah, so I'm a strong believer in facts. I'm a strong believer in setting targets, and I'm a strong believer that if you build it together versus being prescriptive about it, it more likely has a chance to occur. So as I look at things that are going on today, and we'll leave the fertilizer discussion on the side, but to that, I just do want to say one thing. Let's recognize that Canadian farmers, Canadian value chains are absolutely resilient and innovative. I look at the I'm farming the land that I grew up on. In 43 years, the evolution in terms of what we've been able to do, if we look at fertility, crop protection, innovation through seed, etc., we'll continue to do more. But if we go back and we look at some of the things that are happening here now, so we have the sustainable ag strategy. We have the targets that Canada has set. Do we have the right framework in place? I would say yes. Do we have the right leadership? Absolutely. We have great leaders across the country. Do we really need to step up and put the value chain profitability with an environmental lens and with a long-term viability lens and everything else that's been talked about today? Yes. Are we doing that quite yet? Probably not. How do we break it down? And I think Rory alluded to this as well. We need that support right at the center. Agriculture is part of the solution. So let's take that lens to the policy discussion. Let's take that lens in everything that we do, right? And the only way we can get there is a huge amount of education and awareness. I know I continue to learn every day in the new role that I'm in from that perspective. And we all need to put our hands up and say, let's go on this journey together. It's going to be a journey. We're going to change how we do things over time, right? And we're going to focus on the outcomes. And those outcomes are going to be difficult. But from a climate and environment perspective, we must do that so that my daughter can be sitting here 40 years from now and be afforded the same luxuries as it relates to being able to produce food to nourish the country and nourish the world more broadly.
So if you talk about, we have the right leadership in place, we have the right framework in place. It sounds like what we're missing is tools in the toolbox to actually put that into action. So I'm going to go around and ask the four of you this question. But if you were going to kind of pick one tool that we're missing in Canadian agriculture, or that maybe has gotten a little bit rusted and needs to be cleaned up and made work better, what's that kind of one tool in the policy toolbox that we should be looking to focus on in 2023? So I'll go to Chantal first and then Stephanie after, but Chantal, to you first on this.
I'm going to be really bold in this, is that I think when we look at agriculture as a tool, it's not, in the sense that agriculture and environment and others need to come together. So the tool is, the trick in this from a policy perspective is thinking about the ecosystem, the whole system. And we're not driving policy that way right now. And we're not, and albeit it's an evolution that everybody across the value chain needs to go through as well. And that if that does not change and we keep driving policy and or acting in silos, I'll take personal responsibility for that, then we're not going to be able to advance here.
So Chantal's got systems thinking. One of the four key actions we talk about here is CAPI as a tool we need in the toolbox. Go to Stephanie next and then Andrea after. Stephanie, what tool do we need in 2023? Oh, you're muted, Stephanie. Non, on vous entend pas. We're still there.
OK, parfait. Là, c'est mieux. Parfait.
Now it's better. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to echo a bit what I said earlier and what my colleagues at the board of directors of CAPI said as well. We have to think globally. And I think that the first tool that we have to use is ourselves. We who are in the agri-food industry, we have this sensitization. We wake up in the morning, we have to ask ourselves, what can we do further to make our industry go farther? And we talk a lot about leadership in the government and the leadership the public could take, but already here are farmers. They are inspiring. So we have to be inspired by them and act in a more efficient manner. I think that that is possible, and I include myself as a professional too. But Stephanie, we talk about the fact that the status quo is not an option anymore. We have to change things. But I think that this transition, how does the leadership can be used to really prove that there exist solutions and solutions that are opportunities and not risks, as was said before? To understand a little bit the question, in fact, what solutions should we put in the front as far as risks go? No, what's the role of the leadership? You mentioned the fact that we are indeed leaders. So how can we better use the leaders that exist? How can we encourage them? How can we prove that there are solutions that exist? Well, as I said earlier, we frequently have the solutions, we have them. So we have to make sure to communicate them properly, no matter our role. Are we farmers? Are we bankers? Are we scientists? No matter, we have to put at the front the challenges we have on the field to be able collectively to have developed policies and all this as a context to be able to export the competitivity of our field at the global level.
2023.
Sorry, Tyler, can you repeat that? I was still listening.
Sure. No, yeah. So what tool do we need in our policy toolbox in 2023? Oh, we may have. We think we've got a freeze on Andrea. Rory, maybe I'll go over to you to answer this question.
Okay, thanks, Tyler. Well, quickly and perhaps with a little bit of tongue-in-cheek, let me just throw out three things, building off the idea of bold action that Chantal referenced. What about if, okay, I'm the ag minister, I want one big deliverable from the center. I want the ag minister to be put on the cabinet committee on agenda, results, and communications. So the most senior cabinet committee of government, let's put agriculture there. Even if it's for just a couple of years or to the end of the current government's mandate. And in so doing, also put legs under the national, whether it's the National Food Policy Advisory Council or the economic strategy table. We've got to create a center of government forum with the stakeholders present that's reporting right into the center through the minister or ministers to get attention. What about this? All the provincial premiers are demanding a first minister's meeting on healthcare in January. Let's put agriculture on the agenda too. 1 hour in agriculture with a focus on sustainability and resilience. Everyone's aware of how vulnerable, like we've been through COVID, the recognition of the sector's vulnerability are there, but also the importance of it from a sustainability perspective. Let's actually put it on that first minister's agenda and drive some outcomes that can then be translated through the whole system. And then with tongue firmly in cheek, I'm going to say in 2023, government, you give unlimited funding to CAPI. And I say that, though, here's the point, not just from agriculture, a funding model that basically says all government departments that have any connection to the system participate in supporting that kind of deep policy analysis. So there you go.
No, thanks, Rory. I agree that CAPI should be a tool in the policy toolbox in 2023. Andrea, Over to you for the last answer to this question. What tools do we need
Okay.
in our policy toolbox in 2023?
Other than better rural internet, apologies for dropping off. I mean, I'm going to echo a lot of what has been said already. Chantal, the whole idea of systems thinking, I think, is absolutely critical. But I would expand that a bit to talk about just the role of partnerships. You know, when we look at, you know, obviously the power of policy creation is vested in government, but I look at, you know, whether we're talking about ENGOs or think tanks or industry associations, producers, I just love this idea of creating a governance and advisory system that will create the conditions for policy that really works and speaks towards the issues of our time and these intersectional issues. And I will be looking in particular for ways that through partnerships and systems thinking, we can really help advance some of the conservation, specifically biodiversity stuff, in a way that really supports and puts the spotlight on the great stewardship that we see on behalf of so many producers across Canada.
Great, thanks, Andrew. So time's flying by. We're going to come to the last question. I'm going to go to Rory first, but the question is, if you think back at 2022 and think ahead then to 2023, what issue hasn't gotten enough attention in 2022 that should get more attention in 2023?
Well, I'll mention two. The first is zoonotic disease risk or infectious disease. We've seen what that means. COVID, like, it is nothing more important. We've got to have the systems, the response, the research, the emergency response, the protective approach. In Agri-Food and health, we talk about One Health. We are talking and talking about it. We're not executing it. And now more than ever globally, we have to move to a One Health framework to protect the health of our ecosystems and our animal and human populations. African swine fever, not a zoonotic disease, but we just can't underestimate how devastating such an outbreak would be. And the second would be carbon farming. The whole idea that we've got this big opportunity in our sector. We're falling behind in monetizing carbon sequestration, both through regulated and voluntary carbon credit markets. We've got to get our act together to do that in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to go to Chantal and then Andrea next. Chantal, what hasn't gotten enough attention and should get more in 2023?
Yeah, so I would say that a little bit follow up on Rory, but the recognition that Canada is an exporter, right? And we absolutely need to stay competitive. In the environmental lens and things like carbon, et cetera, we really need to be paying attention to what's happening around us and whether Canada is staying competitive from that perspective, on the assumption that as time goes on, that will continue to be a key driver of competitiveness. And I would say that we have a significant amount of work to do there.
Thank you.
The second thing is I would just further reinforce, we need to think about the ecosystem.
Thank you. So Andrea, what needs more attention in 2023?
I mean, I'm going to repeat a little bit what I said just a moment ago, and I think that there's tremendous potential for as Canada works towards its conservation and biodiversity targets. There's a designation. This is a bit inside baseball called OECM. It's sort of like an IUCN working landscape category. I have it in my mind that it's going to be a wonderful thing for producers and for conservation, and I really want to see more attention on raising that up.
Thank you. Et Stéphanie, finalement, le dernier mot, c'est à vous aujourd'hui.
Merci.
Your last word for today. Thank you very much. Well, the two things we should pursue, I mentioned one of them earlier. We have to continue to think globally to protect our agricultural heritage. Management of water, ecosystems, protection of species, all of this is extremely important according to me. And the other thing, an ease of access, I'll mention it again, access to capital. We have it, but we have to use it more adequately to be better positioned. Thank you very much, Stephanie. I hope that next year we will be able to look at these words, the words of all the team, and to be able to say that we had action during the 12 months that are coming.
Thank you for the work that you do around our board table, but thank you also for your expertise and insight today. Before we conclude, I do want to once again highlight an upcoming event that CAPI is hosting with the Global Affairs Institute and CAFTA to bring together leaders from across agriculture, food, security, foreign affairs, and trade. You can register in the link provided in the chat. We look forward to seeing everyone in Ottawa. If you cannot make it to the in-person event in Ottawa, there will be an opportunity to join hybrid. Stay tuned for more details on that. Thank you again for your ongoing engagement and support for CAPI over the last year. We look forward to continuing that engagement in 2023. Have a Merry Christmas, a Happy Holidays, and a Happy New Year. And thank you again for joining us today. Have a great day.